Chief of the Mvezo Traditional Council, Mandla Mandela, is calling for the expulsion of Israel's ambassador to South Africa. This follows a recent controversial decision by the African Union's Commission Chair, Mvezo to grant Israel observer status. The South African government has condemned that decision, which is said to have been granted without consultation with member states. The ANC-led government stands in solidarity with the Palestinian people who are fighting for self-determination from Israel. Let's speak about this now with Chief Mandla Mandela about this call for South Africa's government to do more to challenge Israel's observer status. Mandla Mandela, very good afternoon to you. Thank you for being on Newsfeed PM. So the South African government has already said that it is opposed to the decision. You back that. Why do you think the AU would grant Israel this observer status, knowing that it would be so contentious among member states?
Well, this has been a unilateral decision undertaken by the chairperson of the African Union, which has attracted a lot of contestation because he cannot act unilaterally. He has to be able to take into consideration the vote of member states. And this has been in the exclusion of member states, and this is why you are having a number of African countries objecting to this. And we have seen in the lead of that, the SADC countries are fully behind ensuring that we rescind that decision undertaken by the chairperson of the African Union.
And Israel's foreign ministry, speaking just soon after the uproar that was raised from the likes of South Africa and other African states, said that this could help the country and the AU to cooperate in the battles against COVID-19 and the spread of extremism in Africa. Would you be comfortable with such a collaboration outside the issue of observer status?
Well, we have always known the role of apartheid Israel in supporting our very own apartheid regime during our own struggle for liberation. And Africans in the diaspora have had a history of colonialism and a fight for their own liberation into determining their own self-determination. And therefore, we know the Israeli apartheid regime's authoritarian measures, wherever it has been involved, it has brought sufferings, it has brought death. And therefore, this is just a carrot being dangled in front of African states. We have seen them utilize desalination techniques in terms of bringing water to African countries and third world countries. But the reality is that Israel has never had the interests of Africans. And we see its authoritarian stance in Rwanda, in South Sudan, and how it has been supporting oppressive regimes. And we cannot allow ourselves as Africans being utilized by an apartheid state such as Israel.
Israel and people who support Israel, even in South African communities, often when this discussion comes up, say that even in what has been going on in Gaza, for example, Israel is not to blame. They say they're merely striking back at Hamas, which is targeting Israel, and that is why there's this violence going on, and that the Holy Lands and some of the settlements in question belong rightfully to Israelis, and that it's wrong to say they should be given back to Palestinians. What do you say to that?
Well, we should take a look at our very own context. When a 12% minority of white supremacists governed the Union government of South Africa from 1910, would then that have been regarded that South Africa was led and owned by a racist apartheid regime, and that the vast majority of our people, 87% of our population, was forced into 10% of land which was earmarked as homeland reserves and Bantustans. That is not entirely true, as we've known that we've had to fight for our own struggle for liberation to liberate ourselves. And again, we should go back and look at what country has been there. The country that has been internationally recognized and has been there way before Israel emerged was Palestine. This is a land that, if you look at the maps from pre-1948 to date, has been eaten away by the apartheid Israeli regime, forcefully and illegally taking land of Palestinians. And you've seen that in Sheikh Jarrah, we've seen that in Silwan, where there's forceful removals and Palestinian homes are being demolished by the apartheid regime of Israel. And daily brutalities meted out against innocent women and children in Palestine who are killed on a daily basis spells out what is the injustices that the Palestinians have to witness on a daily basis. So it is total distortion that this is the holy land of Israelis. We are speaking about settler colonialists that are being brought from all over the world in the premise of being Jews, being brought into Palestine and have occupied in colonial occupation and military occupation. And this is why we are spelling out this apartheid Israeli state as an apartheid state. And we are calling on all Africans to regard it as such, and particularly after we've seen the Human Rights Watch report that has investigated and found Israel to be an apartheid state, we are now calling on the United Nations and its member state to declare apartheid Israel as such.
I quickly want to ask you two final questions. The first being, is a closer relationship between the AU and Israel perhaps not an opportunity for countries such as South Africa to then intervene more closely to resolve what's been going on?
It is not. For Israel to be able to come to peace talks, it has to also allow itself to be in a peace process. And again, when we look at our very own transition to democracy, we had to lay a foundation in place that enabled those negotiations to take place. Therefore, you cannot have the referee and the player at the same time, where you have Israelis dictating terms. And we have called for three things in particular for peace processes to even begin in the scenario. We are calling for a release of all political prisoners in Israeli jails. We are calling for all political parties to be unbanned so that they are able to participate in a proper peace process. And then lastly, we are calling for all Palestinians in the diaspora to be given right of return to enable over 6 million Palestinians living in exile to be allowed to return to their homeland so they can be able to be part of a peace process.
Final one then. The International Relations Minister has been on record saying that the issue of closing the Israeli embassy in South Africa at this stage is not on the cards. You want the ambassador, as I understand it, expelled. Do you find that position by government disappointing?
It is a disappointing state. I mean, while we sit and watch on a daily basis innocent women and children being brutalized and killed by the apartheid Israeli regime, we have, as an international solidarity movement and as activists around the globe, started and continue to mobilize for all freedom-loving people of the world against the criminal actions of apartheid Israel. And we want to reiterate this call for the United Nations to lay sanctions, particularly on the embargo of arms, sales against apartheid Israel. Whoever supplies apartheid Israel with arms and arms technology is party to the crimes that are being committed every day against innocent women and children. And we can no longer be complicit. We will continue to mobilize all CBOs and NGOs, all activists, to ensure that we are vocal on the matter and we place this on the global agenda so that Israel is seen as an apartheid state.
Chief Mandla Mandela, thank you for your time this afternoon.